Welcome back to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today on America's Talking, we will be discussing some interesting legislation that has been passed through a couple of states that looks at making illegal immigration, what has historically been a federal crime, a state crime. And joining me today to discuss this is the executive editor of the Center Square. He's back again, folks. It's Dan McCaleb. Hey, Dan.
Cool. How are you?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. When you're on America's Talking, a big smile comes to my face, Dan. We also have associate editor for the Center Square, Kim Jarrett. Kim, welcome to America's Talking.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we also have out of the state of Arizona, Cameron Arcand. It's a staff reporter for the Center Square. Cameron, you're feeling under the weather today, but you joined us anyway, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dan, I want to start with you. As I mentioned, we're talking about illegal immigration. We've talked about illegal immigration before in America's Talking. There has been a major surge of illegal immigration into the United States, which is kind of the backdrop of this discussion today. As I mentioned, there are states around the country who are shifting to try to make illegal immigration a state crime in addition to it already being a federal crime. Let's take a step back real quick. Some people may not realize that it has historically only been a federal crime.
Yeah, that's right, Cole, because the federal government is usually makes treaties, deals with foreign countries, and there are many different states that have borders with both Mexico and Canada. And then you've got the Gulf of Mexico and the various oceans where the states are contiguous to. You know, Florida comes to mind when it comes to Cuba and some other Caribbean states. It has been the federal government's responsibility to deal with immigration law and violations of U.S. Immigration law. But when President Joe Biden took office in January 2021, he and his Department of Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, who has since been impeached because of the border crisis, but the Senate acquitted him or dismissed the charges, I guess I should say, that the House brought against him. Since they unilaterally changed immigration law without congressional approval, it's led to a surge, as you mentioned, in illegal border crossings. Since January 2021, we know there have been more than 12 million border crossers who have been apprehended or have successfully made it into the country without being apprehended. Those folks are called gotaways by federal data. And the state of Texas is borne the brunt of the illegal immigration. Last year, Texas Governor Greg Abbott and the Republican-controlled state legislature worked on legislation that would make illegally crossing into the state of Texas from Mexico a state crime. It has never been a state crime before. It's always been illegal border crossings has always been a federal crime. The day after Governor Abbott signed that measure into law, making illegal border crossing into Texas a state crime, it was challenged. It was challenged in federal courts by a couple of different entities. They have since consolidated those lawsuits. And right now, after a series of conflicting rulings from the district court level to the appeals level, and even the Supreme Court has weighed in once on a procedural matter for this, it's been tied up in the courts. And currently, the law is not being enforced. The new state law is not being enforced in Texas because of a hold that was put on it by the courts, the federal courts.
And Kim, for a long time, we have seen this struggle, in particular in places like Texas, like Dan mentioned, that's a border state. But this struggle between the state and the federal level when it came to the enforcement of illegal immigration, it's normal. We expect to see this in places like Texas, like Arizona. We're going to talk with Cameron in a minute about that. But places like Iowa and Oklahoma have looked at adopting similar legislation that Texas had put forward.
Yes, I cover 7 states for the Center Square, and a lot of the governors that I cover, they say every state is now a border state, is what they're saying, because of what's happening with so many immigrants coming across the border. In Iowa, Kim Reynolds is one of the governors who visited the border earlier this year, along with Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt. She encouraged the legislature to pass Senate File 2340. It makes illegal immigration in Iowa a state crime. Now, it's an aggravated misdemeanor unless the illegal immigrant does commit a crime, and at that point, it is a felony. They also give judges the ability to say, we're going to send you back to the border. Now, in Oklahoma, their bill is still making its way through the legislature. It was just introduced earlier this year by the House Speaker and the Senate Pro Tem. Basically, it creates almost a new crime. It's called impermissible occupation. Now, it is a misdemeanor, but it can be bumped up to a felony. And the judges do have the authority there also to deport anyone if the illegal immigrant is convicted. Now, it's passed the House last week. It is now in the Senate. Now, Governor Stitt has not said yet if he's going to sign that law.
And I think moving back to a border state here, Cameron, the state of Arizona, it's a little different from Texas. Texas, you have a Republican governor. Oklahoma, Iowa, you have Republican governors. You would expect to see these sort of policies in states with Republican governors maybe be more likely to be passed. Arizona, a different political environment where you have a Democratic governor in Katie Hobbs. So we'll talk about what's actually happening with this attempted policy in Arizona, but the execution of this may not be as smooth as in the states of Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas, merely because you do have a, split power between the chambers and the state of Arizona.
Yeah, so I can touch on that. So basically, the Arizona Border Invasion Act, it was Senate Bill 1231, was the first bill that Governor Hobbs vetoed. And it was very dramatic. It was compared to Senate Bill 1070. SB 1070 was a national story from back in 2010. I was probably in third grade eating paste at the time, but it's still very relevant to what we're talking about now. And essentially, it is that same concept where it was a state crime to be in the state of Arizona illegally, not just a federal crime. That was the key principle behind the Arizona Border Invasion Act that was sponsored by State Senator Janae Sham. And so that was the first bill that got vetoed. But it's important to note that they're now, Steve Montenegro on the House side is trying an identical version of this bill, an attempt to get it on her desk again, which office has already said they're going to veto anything like this bill. And that is kind of being held up in the Senate side right now, and will probably make it on her desk sometime within the next month or two again.
And Dan, I want to head back to you. When you were talking earlier, you mentioned we're going to see legal battles. We have seen legal battles, challenges in the courts. Many of these sort of laws, you end up fighting them out in the courts in one way or another. Precedent for a long time has been that this is a federal issue. What are proponents of these bills arguing that this should be a state issue in these court rulings? I mean, are they arguing that the situation has changed, thus the need for enforcement has changed at a different level? I mean, what's different now than, say, in the past when it has only been a federal concern?
It's largely a public safety matter. More than 50 counties, in Texas have declared an invasion at the southern border, saying they're under invasion by a foreign criminal organization, namely the Mexican drug cartels who smuggle in untold amounts of illicit drugs such as fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and other things. And it's also a human smuggling operation. These cartels profit off of moving migrants from Mexico, from Central America, from South America, and even other countries. Customs and Border Protection logs the data where these people are coming from, and there's more than 170 countries where people from across the world have crossed both the southern and the northern borders. So you have these 50-plus counties who've declared an invasion. Governor Abbott himself has declared an invasion, and he says Texas has the right to defend itself from an invasion like this. The folks who are challenging the Texas's law say, no, you don't. It is unconstitutional for this to be a state matter. This is a federal matter, and that's really where the nuts and bolts of the legal challenge is heading.
Dan, do you know of any other policies that are like that in nature, right, that are a federal policy, have historically been a federal policy where there's pushes in states to change that? Any that come to the top of your mind? I mean, it's kind of a unique situation because you're talking about, national security to a degree, right? And then that, and then safety of the citizens of a state. So it seems like a unique situation across the board.
For the most part, but you could really take the recent example of Roe v. Wade and the abortion issue. Completely different issue, obviously, completely different subject matter. The Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade said the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to an abortion for women across the country, with certain exceptions. But when the current Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and for the 40 plus years that Roe v. Wade was in effect, states tried to put more and more restrictions on abortions. If it were too restrictive, the Supreme Court would weigh in and say, no, that's unconstitutional according to the precedent. But then this new Supreme Court 2 years ago, ruling in another case, essentially overturned Roe v. Wade and returned the abortion issue back to the states. And since then, we've seen numerous states either put more restrictions, significant restrictions on abortion, or, and those are mostly red states, Republican-controlled states, or in the case of blue states, Democratic-run states, they've eased restrictions on abortion. Here, I'm based out of Illinois. In Illinois, because many of our surrounding states put a lot more restrictions in place, Illinois completely eased their laws and even invited women from other states who wanted to get an abortion to come to Illinois at taxpayers' expense. So I know it's completely apples and oranges, but for the most part, I agree with your premise that this is unique. You
do have a Supreme Court though that has shown, and historically, when precedents have come up at a federal level, to defer to state law, which could be interesting if this continues to go up kind of the legal chain of command here as we talk about these state laws. I want to go to Kim real quick. Kim, Dan mentioned a little bit ago about the fentanyl in particular, but drugs across the board. You mentioned that a lot of the proponents of this say every state's a border state. One of the big reasons is because of that influx of drugs and human trafficking, as he mentioned. I mean, these don't stay in the border states. They disperse across the nation.
And that's the argument that Governor Reynolds made when she signed the immigration bill in Iowa. Yes, we have the influx of fentanyl, human trafficking, but the main thing she said was they feel like that the Biden administration is not doing its job, so they're going to have to do its job. They're going to have to put it on the backs of their public safety officials to do the job. There's been an other side, though, to this issue, that particularly in Oklahoma, where they've been talking about they're worried now that police officers will racially profile people. They're talking about, hey, particularly in Oklahoma, they've cited numbers of, hey, we already have undocumented immigrants here. And I don't know where they got the numbers, but they held a press conference and said they pay $26 million in taxes and you're going to profile them. And this is not fair. So there's been another side, particularly as the Oklahoma bill weaves its way through, where they're talking about, hey, we don't need this. Just let the federal government do its job. But you have the governors and lawmakers saying, no, the Biden administration is not doing its job.
If I can jump in here too, Kim makes a good point. That's one of the arguments that Governor Abbott and Texas lawmakers have made, is that, and Abbott's come out and said it over and over again, but that President Biden has abdicated his responsibility to secure the states, to protect the states from an invasion, is the term that Texas and Governor Abbott use. And so Texans have a right to stand up for themselves, to secure their own border if President Biden is not going to.
And Dan, real quick, let's stick with you. Has the Biden administration or President Biden or anyone come out from his administration spoke on these policies or these attempts to make illegal immigration a state issue? I mean, what's the, a lot of these Republican governors they're saying, hey, this lays at the feet of the federal government and at the feet of the Biden administration. Well, what are they saying about these potential laws that are at least attempted to be passed?
So the Biden administration, the Biden administration filed a suit challenging this Texas law. But the Biden administration has been involved in all kinds of litigation against Texas. The state of Texas, in addition to passing this law, making illegal entry a state crime, they've been building their own wall. They've been erecting concertina wire fences as a deterrent from people like crossing the shallow portions of the Rio Grande River, where a lot of these illegal crossings occur. The Biden administration or federal agents to start tearing down this wall, these walls or these barriers that Texas has been erecting. That's been in litigation. So, yeah, the Biden administration is absolutely opposed to what Governor Abbott and the state of Texas is doing.
Yeah, and it really sounds like for a lot of these situations, we're going to just see what I'm going to call a legal result. I mean, a court's going to come down and say, this is law, this isn't law, figure it out type thing. Cameron, I think what might be interesting in a state like Arizona, inherently because of the political makeup, it may not even get to a court in its current state of how these laws are being passed, right? Because if it gets vetoed, something like this, it may not even get out of the normal legislative kind of channels. But is there a potential legislative solution here, kind of beyond a legal solution? Is there any indication from, say, Democrats in the state of Arizona to make concessions on this topic, to find a middle ground, anything like that? Or is this very much a black and white issue in the state of Arizona?
Well, it's important to paint a full picture of what's going on in the state. When the Lukeville port of entry was closed by the federal government in December, Hobbs did deploy National Guard troops, but this did come after a couple of weeks. There was a lot of scrutiny on her being able to do that during that time frame. And I think that's really critical to note, that she has taken a very harsh tone with the federal government in regards to how they've been handling this, but has stopped short of signing those Republican-backed bills and has tried to create a distinction. She's repeatedly said, what will work in Arizona is different than what they're doing in Texas. So she is very much stopped short of kind of taking that further step. And in terms of Democratic legislation, since they don't hold either chamber, there hasn't really been that much of an indicator of certain border policy that would signal a crackdown that would be bipartisan. Now, I will say, though, on issues like fentanyl trafficking and penalties for fentanyl offenses, there have been bipartisan legislation that has been passed on that front. That seems to be a little bit more popular. But when it comes to the actual flow of migrants, that actual flow of people, there has been no movement on the legislative side of anything that would get a signature from Hobbs, at least that we've seen yet.
And Kim, an interesting thing about, at least in the case of Iowa versus Texas, Texas has a legal challenge for the Biden administration. Iowa's bill, which is very similar to the Texas law, has not met a legal challenge from the Biden administration, at least as of yet. Is there any reason in particular why, the Texas law was challenged, but the Iowa law wasn't?
The Iowa law does not take effect until July 1st. So that is possibly a reason why there has not been a challenge yet. It does not take effect until later. There may be other challenges coming, though. There's been talk among, groups that may challenge the law, but I don't know if they're waiting until July 1st, but that's the only reasoning possibly that there hasn't been a challenge yet.
And Dan, we got to get ready to wrap up here. And again, we've talked about illegal immigration on America's Talking before. This is obviously a big issue in election year. We've mentioned that before. Do we expect to see more states take action like Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma? I mean, do we expect to see more Republican-led states take this same sort of action, or do we think this is going to kind of remain in the general South border states, southwest of the country? Obviously Iowa and more in the Midwest, but I would be hard for me to believe that this only remains in these three states at the moment.
Well, let me answer it this way. I wouldn't be surprised if more Republican-led states pass very similar laws. The one caveat being, there is this ongoing legal challenge that's probably going to be finally determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. So maybe some of these red states are just taking a wait-and-see approach. Why put the time and the effort in to passing these new laws, if they're only going to get struck down at some point in the future? That said, I do see a long, drawn-out fight over this because it's a very complex issue. It has many different facets to it. So the Supreme Court is currently ending its current session. So I wouldn't be surprised if it does not get settled by the end of June when the Supreme Court recesses for summer break. Who knows, though? It's tough to predict how the court system is going to function with something as complicated as this.
And Dan, one last question for you. How many credits for law school have you over the years of covering all this legislation that gets struck down in the courts or challenged in the courts?
No law school credits here. Just you learn on the fly. It's part of the job of being a journalist, and you try and you share others' more expert folks' legal analysis. Then you draw your own. I've been covering the courts for, I won't share how long. Let's just say I'm a seasoned journalist.
A seasoned journalist.
I'm a seasoned journalist, Cole. And sometimes you still get surprised by what happens in the courts.
Well, Dan, Kim, Cameron, thanks for joining us on America's Talking today. This is a fascinating subject. And again, we'll have to follow this in all the kind of the courts as this goes up and may go all the way to the Supreme Court. For you listeners, if you enjoy this episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. We'll see you next time on the next episode of America's Talking. Do you care about classroom curriculum, transparency policies, and how your taxpayer dollars are invested in education, but you find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? Chalkboard News is bringing you straight news reporting on public K-12 education. We're talking news without spin. Chalkboard News publishes fact-based stories that make sense to parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com. Subscribe today at chalkboardnews.com.